Why wouldn't you start with someone who knows what they're talking about? It's the same with financial planning. When people say, so when would you go with an advisor? Well, always. I wouldn't go and do it yourself. Some people are extremely skilled in these things and maybe don't need that, but I would say that's the exception to the rule.
Welcome back to the ClearEstate podcast, a discussion series where we get real about estate planning and settlement and our efforts to disrupt old systems with new technology and a good dose of empathy. I'm Davide Pisanu, the co-founder and CEO of Canada's only technology company providing truly complete estate management services. That's estate planning, estate administration, and what we're going to talk about today, professional executorship. In our last episode, and basically every episode, we talk a lot about the pain of being an executor, but also about the fact that sometimes it's perceived as an honor, or at least sometimes the person planning their estate perceives the naming of the executor as an honor. And as we know, and as we've talked about many times, it's actually a burden. Hundreds of hours of work, a bit of money. Fundamentally, people ask me all the time, should we all get a professional executor? Should that be the default? And the answer is yes. Now, for some estates, it's probably not worth it given the rollover provisions or the amount of money in the estate. And some estates will end up being so simple that a professional executor would be overkill. But in a way, making professional executorship as available as possible is the way the space should go and the market should go. And I'm a firm believer that this is not something that non-professionals should be doing ever, because it's just not fun and it's not worth it and it's a headache. And it's not something that you need to learn because other people know how to do it and they should just do it for you. The reality is that it's a painful experience. We ran a survey here at ClearEstate, and the majority of people that have experienced being an executor describe it as one of the most difficult challenges of their lives. Pretty traumatic, actually. So that brings up, well, what's the alternative? What's the solution if I'm planning my estate and I don't want to name a family member because I don't want that family member to be burdened? So there is a solution. Professional executorship. Various people, individuals offer this service. There's companies offering this service, and by companies I really mean trust companies. And there's ClearEstate, who offers this service in partnership with a trust company, actually. And so today, what we're going to talk about and think about is, first of all, like, what are the reasons to use a professional executor? Why should I, or why are my circumstances so complicated or so particular that I should pick a professional executor? And we'll realize, well, it doesn't actually mean that your situation is, or my situation is, very complicated. It's just it makes good sense for a lot of people to seriously consider not naming a family member as their executor. So what does a professional executor do? Well, first of all, they're a third party, and that already takes away a bunch of the problems we've been talking about, which is conflict between siblings, which is, conflict of interest in decision making, so on and so forth. The second thing is that they do this for a living, in the sense that they have the systems, the expertise, at ClearEstate, the technology. And so from a pain standpoint, or from an experience standpoint, the experience for them is very different than somebody that does this as a layperson. I always say people that are named executor are not going to be named executor multiple times in their lives, maybe once or twice. But if it's more than 5 or 10, you're a highly unlucky person. So in a perfect world, everybody would have access to a professional executor. So yeah, it is theoretically a little bit more money for the estate, but it's also money saved and time saved for the executor. And it's a lot less complicated for the family to manage through the conflict, the paperwork, and the grieving process. Most people have the thought that they can handle selling the estate. At ClearEstate, we talk all the time to families that come to us for planning. And then there's a couple of questions that you ask that actually make people think about, well, maybe a professional executor is a good idea. The complexity of the estate obviously plays a certain role. And by that, I mean nature of the assets, I mean wealth levels. That's part of it. Even without having multiple mansions and multiple operating companies in multiple jurisdictions, cases of reconstituted families, cases of where there's conflict between siblings, cases of where people don't have children and don't really know who their executor could be and don't want to burden a friend or another family member. And I would say ultimately, a lot of the people that end up considering professional executorship, there are people that went through it themselves as executors and just don't want to do this to some of their loved ones. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to be joined by Christine Van Cauwenberghe. Christine is a great friend of ClearEstate. She's one of the top leaders in estate and financial planning in Canada. She has a law degree. She's a lawyer. She began working with financial planners as a lawyer, and then she joined STEP Canada, the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners. That's the body that oversees the estate professionals and the TEP designation in Canada for the Trust and Estate Practitioners, TEP. She actually led the creation of the educational program that guides the work of Canada's 4,000 TEP estate professionals. She joined IG Wealth, and she's been an innovator there for 20 years. Last year, ClearEstate partnered with IG, and we're offering our solution through their network. And we've been amazingly lucky to be able to work with all the professionals at IG, but particularly with Christine. She's dedicated her career to elevating the knowledge level of financial planners around this topic, estate planning and estate administration. She wrote the leading book in Canada on some of these issues called Wealth Planning Strategies for Canadians. It's a handful as a book, but highly recommend getting a copy if you're interested in this space. And it's updated annually. So amazing. We'll talk to Christine. We'll talk about professional executorship. Please don't forget to subscribe to the ClearEstate podcast on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Today, we have Christine Van Cauwenberghe, a great friend of ClearEstate, a partner, a supporter. Really, really glad that you can join us, Christine.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So we're going to chat about professional executorship. But before we go in that, I mean, we talk on a regular basis, Christine, but we've never chatted about your book, Wealth Planning Strategies for Canadians. I just wanted to know, like, how did it come about? Like, so you've been publishing this for a number of years now. It is the reference book in the industry. How did it come about? And how do you find time to put it together every year? That's the real question.
Well, now I'm starting to feel old when I think back, because I've been practicing law for more than 30 years. And I did practice law for, well, not quite 10 years before I came to IG Wealth Management. And what I found was that when I came into the financial planning world, as opposed to the legal world, there just weren't very many books, if any books, that were geared towards helping people develop a comprehensive financial plan. So there certainly were books on legal issues for lawyers. There were books on tax issues for accountants. But when the financial planners I was working with would ask me for a reference guide, I had a very difficult time finding anything that was geared towards them. And I had some very clear expectations as to what I was looking for. First of all, I wanted a book that was geared towards the client. So, giving someone a book that has chapters like wills and trusts and all that kind of stuff isn't very meaningful. But if the chapters in my book are, common law, married, separated, divorced, single, tell me what I need to know for a client in that situation. I then itemize the strategies relative, that are relevant for that client. Then I included a bunch of case studies, and then I also included the rules for each and every province and jurisdiction in Canada, which vary quite significantly. And that was the other problem. I could maybe find a book relevant to Ontario alone or to Quebec, but I couldn't find anything that dealt with all the provincial anomalies. And I just got so frustrated that I wrote it myself. And I wrote it in what I call the years BC, before child. In the years AD, after diapers, I've, updated it, but I didn't write it. So I wrote it before I had my son, and now it's almost in its 20th edition because people keep asking me to update it, and I still haven't found anything else that I could recommend to advisors. I almost wish I could, and then I could stop. But at this point, I think we'll keep going.
Well, we must have bought like 30 copies here at ClearEstate, so
Good to know.
we're fans, and thank you for doing this. It's a tremendous amount of work. I can just imagine. So talking about professional executorship, at ClearEstate, we've been in this business for 5 years, and I've personally, through that journey, have developed pretty strong views about professional executorship and its role in I would say the estate planning and estate administration space. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. I know some of them, but we've never had a comprehensive conversation around it. But just for the sake of intro, what's a professional executor? How would you describe it?
In my mind, a professional executor is any organization or individual who is in the business of administering estates for a fee, but hopefully is doing it on a more, as the name would imply, a professional level than a layperson. And I think that there's still a severe lack of understanding in Canada that these services even exist, because most people, when they draft a will, they do just designate a layperson. They designate a family member or a friend or someone who, well, for the most part, let's be blunt, has no clue what they're doing. And a professional executor is someone who specializes in this, and this won't be their first rodeo. It's something that they do regularly, and you can have some confidence that they're going to be able to help the beneficiaries as opposed to sort of everyone running around not knowing what to do. That makes the situation even more stressful after the time of death.
And in your experience, where do people find these professional executors?
Well, in our experience, because I worked for IG Wealth, we've got financial planners who are often initiating the discussion with their clients about estate planning. And in many cases, clients will say, well, and I'd love to do a will, I just don't know who to appoint as executor, right? And so it's the financial planner who is suggesting these options. And we've worked with other trust companies before, and we still certainly provide our clients with options. But I will say that, we have been recommending ClearEstate a lot recently because of the fact that you're so digitally enabled, and clients, it comes as a relief to them to know that there are services available to them because no one else has offered it. Sometimes the lawyers might suggest it, but clients don't even want to go see a lawyer in the first place because they don't know who to appoint. So they're just sort of at home, wringing their hands, not sure what to do. And until they start that conversation, they don't even realize that there's a solution to the problem. So it's often the financial planner who suggests it.
When does it make sense for a family to appoint a professional executor? Like, are there typical kind of like cases? Is there a wealth threshold? Is there a complexity threshold? Like, how do you think about it?
I've actually been telling a lot of clients and colleagues, to almost think about appointing a professional as the default, and then saying to yourself, okay, when wouldn't I appoint a professional? And I think, you have to make sure, do I have a family member that I trust, or a friend or colleague that I really, really trust, who, lives in my jurisdiction, has sufficient time and capacity to manage it, won't charge an arm and a leg? Because understand, in most provinces, if you choose a layperson, they can charge a fee. They can usually charge up to 5% for doing a lousy job. And versus you can go to ClearEstate and they'll charge 1% for doing a professional job. So my attitude is usually, why wouldn't you start with someone who knows what they're talking about? It's the same with financial planning. When people say, so when would you go with an advisor? Well, always. I wouldn't go and do it yourself. So, some people are extremely skilled in these things and maybe don't need that. But I would say that's the exception to the rule. I would start with the premise that you probably should choose someone who knows what they're going to do. Yes, they're going to charge a fee, but actually probably a lower fee for doing a better job.
Interesting because you're talking about the cost, and I think for me there's multiple ways of thinking about it. There's the cost of the professional, the cost of the layperson, but there's also, even if you appoint a family member, there's a cost to that person as well, in the sense that they're going to have to spend hundreds of hours, and there's an opportunity cost for them even though they're not billing their time. So how do you talk about that to clients?
Well, actually, I was just in a region office yesterday talking about ClearEstate, and we were talking about choosing executors. And he said, for a lot of people, they think, oh, who am I going to choose as executor? Who am I going to bestow this great honor? And it's more like, who am I going to give this massive ball and chain to? Right? It is not, I mean, I suppose it is an honor, but it is a massive obligation. And most people don't even have the courtesy to tell the person, oh, by the way, I've designated you as my, executor, which, by the way, if someone doesn't know, they can always just say, I'm not going to do it,
Yeah.
right? Decline, which puts your estate in an even bigger pickle. But when people accept, it's just this huge source of stress because they don't know where to begin, and they don't know that they could also hire a lawyer, hire an accountant, hire people to help them. But um, they sort of scramble around. And actually, one of the biggest costs, I think, for estates, you were talking about, the costs. What if you have a business that needs to be sold right away, or a specific type of property that needs to be secured or properly appraised, and people don't know how to do that? And we've seen people sort of sit on investments for a while or properties, and it's not properly maintained, and everyone's just paralyzed, and that costs the estate a lot. And as you imply, it costs the executor, the lay executor, a lot of personal stress, which is why they do often charge a fee, because they feel it's been a huge imposition on me, mostly because they've spun their wheels for hours and hours and they just don't know what they're doing.
It's really interesting. You mentioned the honor, and we had a whole episode on that where we said, well, yes, it's an honor in some ways, but love the ball and chain type of analogy. Um, you talked about businesses, you talked about properties, you talked about investments, and how a professional handles that differently. Tell us a little bit more about that. How does a professional handle complexity differently than a layperson?
Yeah, and we don't even necessarily have to take that complex a situation. So I was recently speaking with an advisor, and they said, well, my client isn't sure about designating clear estate because the major property for the major asset for this estate is their house. That's basically, and for a lot of Canadians, that is their major asset.
Yeah.
And they said, they want to make sure that that house is sold, at the highest possible, value. And I said, well, of course. And they said, well, what process would ClearEstate follow? And I said, well, let's ask them. So ClearEstate sent us an answer, and it involved getting appraisals. And I think it was actually a couple of appraisals and a different process and that sort of thing. And the advisor said, so, is that, would that be a good approach? I said, so can you tell me what approach this layperson would take? Because as far as I'm aware, no one gets appraisals. No one, like, I looked at what ClearEstate did, and it was, I can't say there's any magic to saying, oh, well, this is going to get the absolute highest amount. But most people, if they're doing it on their own, they hire some real estate agent who they met at the golf course. They just, throw something together, hope for the best, sell it as soon as possible, and say, yeah, I guess that's the highest market rate. Like, they don't have any clues to what they're doing. So ClearEstate has a bunch of protocols in place for selling these various assets. Most lay people don't have any protocols whatsoever. So that in itself is where you're going to get just that added level of objectivity, making sure that it's sold at the right time, making sure that the assets are secured, making sure that people don't rush and sell it at fair sale price. A lot of times when people are acting as a lay executor, there's all sorts of emotion. Sometimes people refuse to sell things. Oh, I like that cottage, I'm going to keep it. Actually, the other people want to sell it, and they want their value out of it, right? So you need that objective third party who may at some point have to say, okay, well, are you going to, how are we going to deal with this, right? So, and then there might be a tough conversation, but it's easier to come from an objective third party than from a family member, because sometimes it just causes paralysis within the family because no one wants to deal with the tough issue.
One of the things that we see is that objective third party is a major plus in situations where there may be family disagreements, there may be tension, Do you have examples in your mind of where a professional executor made a difference, I would say, like in a tough family situation?
I might give an example of a situation where they're acting as power of attorney. And that's something I don't think that people realize, that, you can hire a corporate power of attorney as well. And we are seeing a number of situations where clients are living longer. They don't have capacity. And so you have to appoint someone as your attorney under a power of attorney, not a legal, not acting as a lawyer, but acting as your attorney under a power of attorney, and or mandatory in Quebec. And, these people, again, have no experience, don't know what they're doing. And they think, oh, I've just been given the keys to my parents' piggy bank. I have complete control over their investment accounts. And I'd really like a new kitchen. So I'm going to ask my investment advisor for a couple $100,000 to renovate my kitchen. At which point we have to say, I'm sorry, that's not what it's meant for. And it starts to get a little bit tense when we're refusing transactions, because we have to say, so how is that in the donor's best interest? You're not the client. Your parent is the client. How is it in your parent's best interest that you renovate your kitchen? Oh, my parent would want me to have this money,
Of
right?
course.
And then, we'd say, well, what about your siblings? Oh, well, they don't need to know. And right, it just, if you're dealing with a professional, that conversation's not happening. The professional's saying, well, no, this is not in your, the money belongs to your parents. If there were provisions for, dependents and people who need the money, I mean, it's not that there's no access to the money. And in fact, actually, sometimes the power of attorney who's a professional will take out the money a little faster, because they'll give their parents a better standard of living and a higher quality of life. Because sometimes the kids are like, yeah, no, they don't need that fancy nursing home. We'll put them in the lower cost nursing home, right? So it's just a little more objectivity when in a situation where there are no black and whites to these things, right? So you have to use your best judgment. And someone who's a professional and has seen this movie before in multiple situations, knows what's normal, knows what's reasonable in that situation, and can just exercise better judgment.
I think a lot of people forget that professional actually acts as a trustee, and like, so basically in the best interest of whomever the trust has been created for, or the power has been granted for. And that's the power of being a professional, where you know your duties and you carry them out in the best interest of the beneficiaries. Your typical client, when they hear about a professional executor, whether that's ClearEstate or somebody else, like, what do they have in their minds that you guys have to kind of talk them out of?
Well, the first issue is people don't even realize that these services are available. So anything that's new, it's just a little bit of a, okay, what is this about? Second thing is cost. They assume it's going to cost more, even though, as I've already mentioned, they don't realize that the layperson could charge more. And then the third thing is, well, will they administer the estate the way my family would administer the estate? And I said, well, they're not going to go into the house and burn all the family photos. Like, they're going, they're going to make sure that the personal effects are distributed fairly. But again, probably more fairly, because what I have seen is one child act as executor, and they go in the house and they take all the family photos and they don't share things, right? So, yeah, they'll probably act in a more business-like manner, but in the end, that will likely cause fewer arguments between all the parties. So, I think it's just a lack of understanding of how it works, and it's for a lot of people, it's just never crossed their mind before.
I'd love to ask you a impromptu question, because I think everybody in this business has kind of their horror stories. So what's your estate shit show that remains in your mind as the worst absolute story you've ever heard?
Oh my gosh. There's so many. I think of this one's an old one, but there was a lawsuit between two siblings as to the reason why I brought up family photos. One person had an original of the photo. So this is obviously before digital photos. One person had the original of the photo, and another person had a photocopy of the photo, and they sued each other over who had the original and who had the photocopy. I mean, when you think of how petty can you be, right? And the number of families that never speak to each other again after these estates go wrong, I've just vacation properties also just seems to be a massive source of angst and arguments. Yeah, personal effects, family photos, that's family vacation properties. Those tend to be anything where there's any emotion. that tends to be the thing that causes the most strife. Sometimes businesses, I've seen a few go badly where, there's a succession issue. If you think of the TV show, one child thought that they would be CEO, the other child thought they would be CEO, that kind of stuff. But I'd say it's usually the really, really small, petty things where the actual item doesn't have a lot of value to anyone outside of the family, but they're willing to burn the whole thing down over one small thing. There was one client, they said, "Why are you being so difficult?" And she said, when I was a child, my brother had me in a headlock and never said sorry. And that's why she sued. That was her comment over a childhood tussle.
It's funny because Alex told us the story about a family torn apart over the last apple pie that was frozen. And so basically, mom's last apple pie was in the freezer, and everybody wanted to get access to it, and complete madness over the last artifact of the cooking skills of that particular person. So you never know what's
That's
going to
outrageous.
you,
Oh
you,
my
you
gosh.
never know what's going to go wrong. You mentioned businesses. What do professional executors do when people have operating businesses and or more complex business situations?
Well, usually they go in and make sure that all the assets are secure. They make sure that everything is going to continue to run. If the person who passed away is the owner manager, the first thing they'll need to do is identify new management. And sometimes there's, an interim manager that they're able to appoint. Sometimes they have to bring in someone from outside. But the main thing is to make sure that all the suppliers continue to get paid, that there's that source of that the business keeps running. Because if there's any uncertainty in the market, all of a sudden the owner manager has passed away. What does this mean? Our contracts are not going to be fulfilled. A business can go sideways pretty darn quick. Look at Air Canada. It was shut down for 2 days, and now, it's chaos. So you want to make sure that there's that continuity there. And again, if there's an objective third party who says, look, it's the sister who is going to be CEO for a while, not the brother, and that's based on XYZ objective decision, or at least the interim CEO will make a longer term decision later. It's harder to argue with that than when it's just family members and they just can never, ever, ever come to an agreement.
Yeah, I think businesses should have a succession plan anyway outside of the estate, but you're pointing out the role of an objective third party for sure in handling that. Christine, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was a real pleasure to have you, and I'm going to ask you to come back on multiple other topics that you're more qualified than all of us to talk about. So it's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you very much. And I do appreciate you taking the time to have this discussion. I think it's a really important conversation for people to have. And I know that estate planning in general is it's a tough one because you're talking about your own mortality. And, even in my own family, like in my husband and I, we've had updated estate plan several times, but, it is emotional. What would happen with this or that, or, or a child. And I think that it's a gift to the next generation when you do talk about it, but it takes some intention. And I appreciate you taking the time to initiate that conversation with your clients.
Thank you. So we wanted to end each episode with a bit of a chat with one of our experts, the main expert at ClearEstate, Sarah, head of estate planning and settlement solutions at ClearEstate. How are you, Sarah?
Doing good. Thanks, Davide.
We heard from Christine, super interesting, big fan of ClearEstate. What's your key takeaway from that conversation? She's a big proponent of professional executorship and clearly realizes the pitfalls of just appointing a family member as an executor. So that's what I took from that. And I mean, there's emotional challenge there. There's difficulty handling the estate, planning the estate. What's your key takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, I think Christine made a lot of great points and certainly has a lot of great insights, and knows quite a bit, I think, about the kind of financial planning conversations, that are being had. I think, one of my key takeaways was really that the more we educate folks that, this service actually exists and make them realize that, how having a lay executor versus a professional executor truly compares, because there are lots of misconceptions out there about both what the service is, how much it costs, and how potentially impersonal people maybe mistakenly think that it is. I think those are some of the key kind of points that Christine raised excellently there.
We tend to feel like the executor is, I mean, we typically think of a family member, we think about the emotional aspects of this. I mean, you've been a professional executor. How different is the experience of the beneficiaries of the estate dealing with a professional executor versus dealing with a family member as the executor, or all beneficiaries being co-executors, for example?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think that at the end of the day, like most of the folks who work in the field of, settling estates are highly empathetic, and highly motivated by genuinely helping families, right? So even though there may be this inclination to just think of it as like, some big corporation, right? Some big bad corporation is coming in here and, getting paid to do paperwork. Like when we talk about estate professionals, like these are folks that, genuinely care about the job that they're doing and the families that they support. So while it is, as a professional, like it's still real people at the end of the day, right? With feelings and empathy and insights and compassion for the families that they're dealing with. So I think it's kind of important to understand that, hiring a professional doesn't mean that, your your estate is now some sort of,
A file somewhere in a bank.
exactly, exactly. And actually, I'll give you an example from my personal experience where, there's lots of times when, you know, the estate settlement, starts and the professional now, it's actually their first introduction to the family, right? Because despite what we maybe recommend, which is like having those family conversations, those don't always happen, right? So sometimes the family is meeting, the professional executor for the first time after the death, right? And I can tell you a number of times where there's kind of it's a bit standoffish at first, right? It's and which I understand, right? They don't understand what is going to happen. They don't understand how they're going to be treated. They don't understand the process, what's involved. And so there's almost like this dance that happens of, explaining things, communicating clearly, giving them, expectations and then meeting those expectations, where, by the end of things, they've really come around to understand that actually this was a gift and they're glad that they weren't doing it, on their own, without professional, guidance and support, and especially this type of specialized, guidance and support where, going back to your original question, like the key difference is that, you still have people who care involved in the process. They just deal with this stuff every day, right? So they actually know what they're doing. And Christine made another excellent point about how, professionals have protocols in place, right? Like when it comes to dealing with, real estate or business assets or whatever the case may be, there are protocols that are already in place. We already know what to do. We already see what's normal, what's, kind of industry standard, what's expected of an executor, and including the pitfalls, right? And where things can go wrong. So I think, the key difference is that you still have, empathy and compassion and people involved, but you've kind of elevated, the knowledge and expertise that things are being done with.
I mean, you talk about training protocols, basically somebody that knows what they're doing. Are all professional executors TEPs, for example, trust and estate practitioners? Do you have, or is this a good to have
Yeah,
or must have?
yeah.
What do we see in the industry?
Yeah, so there's no like standard you must have like this precise, designation or training in order to act as a professional executor. Although, of course, there are rules around, trust licenses, which are highly regulated, and where a company can be appointed in a will or a power of attorney for property. But there's no real precise, designation or training that you must get. I would say there's a few that are, well recognized, including, the Trust and Estate Practitioner from STEP Canada. Canadian Securities Institute also has one called Member Trust Institute that's, highly regarded as well. Um, but I would say, most importantly, it's, what type of experience, does the professional executor have, right? If it's whether it's kind of a lawyer who's willing to do it, but they don't normally really do it a lot in their practice, or, it's an accountant, or it's maybe a consultant type of, service where they're kind of doing it in their own name as a professional. Uh, I think all of those are, varying to varying degrees of experiences in terms of how they would actually go about the estate settlement. But there's not really a set, you must have this in order to do so.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention, people don't know this, but essentially it's either a trust company or it's an individual. And then
Correct. Yeah. That's
and
a
as
super great point. Yeah.
and as an individual, you're acting as an individual. You're not
Correct.
acting as a professional. And so whether it's a lawyer, an accountant, they're basically acting. This is not the practice of their profession, correct? They're acting as an informed individual, essentially informed by their professional experience. So
Correct.
it's important to point out because most people
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll take that one step further just to really emphasize the nuance there is that, of course, if you have a company that's acting under a trust license, then you have some reassurance of continuity in, there actually being a professional that's going to be, willing and able to act because it's under the trust license umbrella. And, most trust companies in Canada are, decades, if not over 100 years old. So essentially, it allows you the peace of mind that there's always going to be someone there to administer your estate. Whereas if you have an individual professional, while that can also be a good choice, that individual, they may retire one day, right? Like something may happen to them. They may not, they may become unwell and not able to act. And they may pass away themselves. Like all of those things need to be taken into consideration as well.
I know we see this a lot at ClearEstate, but what are your thoughts on co-executorship with a professional executor? So basically naming a family member, typically a spouse, and a professional executor. It feels like somebody might think, "Oh, that's the best of both worlds.
Mhm.
I'll have a family member, and then I'll have the professional to guide them." We understand the pitfalls. I think would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a great question. And like many great questions, I think the answer is it depends. But the reality is it can create you know, a bit of a team, right? Like one that is a professional who, knows what they're doing, you can be satisfied that they're going to carry out all the right steps, and one or potentially more who know more on the personal side. And it gives you this reassurance that, they're going to be involved in the decision making from your personal perspective, right? Because they knew you well and all those things. So yes, I can see that it can create a good team, maybe even a great team. But the pitfalls are also very real in that uh, it can also cause delays and issues in the estate settlement. If, let's say, for example, the lay co-executor wants to do something that the professional executor does not feel is prudent, right? Or is not following the proper rules or protocols, right? And I've seen this occur where they're like, well, I actually just want to buy the cottage property. Like I want to get that instead of, selling it and I want to get it at, X value, right? Like
50% off.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Or sometimes it has to do with, how funds are invested or things where, that layperson might have a certain opinion or perspective that works well for them in their life, but is not necessarily appropriate as a,
Not best practice, or
exactly.
not in the best interest of the beneficiaries of the estate.
Exactly. And when a professional, is held to the highest of standards for, carrying out their duty as a fiduciary, like they really have to think carefully about all of the steps that they're taking and whether or not these are truly in the best interest of all the beneficiaries of the estate, right? Whereas an individual lay executor often, not necessarily with malice, but they just don't necessarily have that same perspective. I mean, I talk about this a lot that you're basically asking them to wear two hats. Sometimes even more than two hats, because sometimes they're a executor or co-executor and they're also a beneficiary, and sometimes they're also the parent of other beneficiaries. So that's actually difficult. Like it's difficult to do, to sit in and wear all these multiple hats and truly act, impartially. So with caution, I would say it's not a bad thing to have co-executors, but if it gives you comfort, but there's a reality that it can cause, issues and delays in your settlement.
Professional executors and what we're calling here lay executors, which basically means somebody that does not do this professionally. Like, is there a difference between what they can and cannot do, or it's more of a qualitative difference in the sense of like the powers are the same,
Yeah.
but qualitatively, what will a professional executor do that just a random person being appointed, and by random I mean
Yeah.
they're important to the planner, but they're that's not what they do on a day in day out basis. What's the difference? A couple
Yeah.
of examples. You talked about protocols and process and fiduciary duty practice day in, day out, and therefore you have the right reflexes. But do you have a couple of examples of something that would be materially different if you're a professional versus not?
Yes, absolutely. First off, there is no material difference essentially between what the responsibilities are of a professional executor versus a lay executor. When it comes to fiduciaries, duties and responsibilities, they are the same under, legislation in all jurisdictions. The rules that a professional has to follow are the same rules that an individual has to follow. But the difference, I would say, is that if things are ever scrutinized, and they often are for various reasons, and not necessarily simply, a lawsuit or things like that, but under scrutiny either from the probate court or CRA or even a beneficiary that's, just asking, important questions. Um, Professional executors do, I would say are held to the highest standard, right? So a court, for example, would expect that a professional executor is not just as good as a layperson acting as an executor, but that they're in fact better, right? Because they should know better. And while they expect both to be prudent, I think they would expect the professional executor to be, above reproach, really, right? In the way they go about things, in the way they document things, in the way they come to decisions, right? So, for example, most professional executors, trust companies in particular, they would always have kind of a decision by committee process, right? Wherever there's discretion that needs to be exercised in an estate or in a trust, they're always going to discuss it, internally, and that's going to include, perhaps somebody with legal experience, somebody with tax experience, somebody with managerial experience over the estate settlement process, and they're all going to need to actually come to an agreement on the prudent course of action, right? And then they document that
In an unbiased
in
way.
in an unbiased way, exactly, and then obviously they're also going to, and I think this is really important, even professional executors, like they're not necessarily going to know everything, right? Like they're not going to know, they're going to deal with assets that they're not necessarily experts at, right? Like, for example, oh, there's a vacant, piece of land up in Northern Ontario. And so they're going to go and seek appropriate professional expertise on, okay, what is the market for that particular piece of land in that particular area, right? They're going to talk to real estate agents, they're going to talk to an appraiser. Like they're going to follow a process so that they can make informed, prudent, discretionary decisions by committee about what should take place and what should happen. Whereas lay executors, they're much more inclined to go on kind of like feelings, right? On like their gut feeling or like, oh, mom told me that this property was worth X. And then they've fixated on that because that's what they kind of expect. Well, that could have been many years ago, or that could have been when there was more developed around that area, or there could be all sorts of reasons why things that lay executors tend to kind of hang their hats on no longer necessarily make sense. And then that actually leads to kind of poor decision making, right? And I'll give you a specific example that actually happens all the time is when it comes to selling real estate. Um, Lay executors tend to, much like you and I, like much like everyday people do, they tend to inflate the value that they expect to sell their property for. And that's either because, they had a conversation with some of their buddies, or, a realtor has tried to woo them and, has said, oh, you could get this much for it, right? And not to knock realtors, right? Like they're also hopeful for what they can sell the property for. But they fixate on those amounts, right? And sometimes to the estate's detriment, because then what we end up seeing is, okay, in today's market, like the value of your home only really matters on the day you sell it, right? Like if that makes sense. So when folks are going to sell a real estate property and they have this kind of emotional attachment, especially if it was, their parents' property and their parent has now passed away, and that was kind of, like Christine mentioned, like it is a lot of Canadian families, that's their main asset. Like that's the main asset that parents are passing on to their kids. And so they have this sense of how much it's supposed to sell for. And then, they tend to disregard the reality that takes place, right? And sometimes that reality can include the property sitting there for months, with
with carrying costs and so on and so forth. And
significant carrying costs,
yeah.
right? Sometimes they're condos with maintenance fees, right? You got to keep the electricity, if it's a house, there's potentially, snow removal, all those things to help and keep the house, looking appropriate and in good maintenance and repair. And so at the end of the day, any waiting and trying to get that perfect offer doesn't always translate to a benefit to the estate, because you've actually had to pay a lot of money to get it to that point, right? Or a lot of times people will think, well, my mom always planned to like do this big renovation and they want to do the renovation. And most of the time, this is actually not a prudent course of action because, maintenance and repairs for sure, but like anything beyond that, that's, I understand that obviously it can increase the property's value, but, 9 times out of 10, you start a renovation, you uncover things you weren't expecting, the budget gets overblown. Like these are the kinds of scenarios that lay executors get themselves into all the time.
In my experience, every renovation I've ever done to my homes have generated zero value against the increase in market
Right.
price. Because when you factor in just the fact that the market is going up,
Yeah.
then you're actually not getting that much return on the unless you're flipping the house, correct? But if it's just your own house, you can live in it 5, 6, 7 years. By the time you sell it, you have to redo the renovation anyway because the kids destroyed the kitchen anyway. So it's very interesting. You talked about beneficiaries. So what's the relationship like between beneficiaries and a professional executor? And I think for the estate, it's short, but for POAs might be longer, for trusts might be longer. How does that work? Like, do you have a 1-800 professional executor on call, call them, complain, want more money? Like
It is.
how's the relationship?
Yeah, I guess, most people won't be surprised. Like the most common questions are really,
How much?
how much am I getting and when am I getting it, right? And I think that it's important to answer those questions as soon as you practically can. So for sure, that is something that as a professional executor, it's not just, oh, just wait, we'll reach out to you. I think there's
Don't call us, we'll call you.
yeah, exactly. There is a standard of periodic communication at, particular milestones in the process, right? I think in the beginning, it's really important to have a open conversation with all of the beneficiaries so that they understand, the process. You can give them some clear steps. There also might be some actionable things for them that they need to do, documentation that they need to submit. And also, they may have information that you need if there's pieces missing of, their loved one's complete, asset picture. You might even be validating some stuff with them. But I would say most importantly is, consistent and clear communication about, timelines, what's involved in processes. And updates, right? Because sometimes things do go wrong. And when you're dealing with bureaucratic matters, often there's like, oh, there's this new thing that, a financial institution needs or whatever the case may be. And so being clear and setting expectations and then kind of meeting those expectations is super important. What I will say too is that oftentimes what ends up happening, and I think this is, a good thing for families, is that the professional executor does kind of take the brunt of the stress and the strain. So that might include, you know, um, people kind of feeling a certain way, right? Feeling not great about whatever the case may be. Sometimes it really has nothing to do with the estate settlement, and they're just grieving and processing, and they're maybe taking it out on the people that they're interacting with, and on a process they don't necessarily feel fully informed about, right?
Or
Um,
in control.
or in control of, absolutely. And I think that, like I said earlier, you have people that are, working in this field are, I think, genuinely compassionate individuals. And so, like they can take it, right? Like they would rather, we would rather take it than have you take it out on your sibling or your partner or your loved ones.
If I'm a beneficiary and I'm dealing with a professional executor and I'm unhappy, what's the recourse? I mean, so communication probably is step one. But where does it go after that?
I do think that knowing the right questions to ask, are super important, and understanding what you're entitled to as well are really important. So, for example, if you're a residual beneficiary, meaning you get a share of the estate after the debts are paid, then, you do have a right to an accounting of the assets of the estate. Now, there is a reasonable period of time where the executor is able to kind of be collecting information. Typically, we say, the executor's year, the first year of the estate settlement is kind of, there's leeway for the executor to be like finding out information and dealing with bureaucratic processes and getting, sort of all their ducks in a row. But that's not to say they can't be, reporting to beneficiaries. And like I said, I think best practice is to proactively communicate with beneficiaries. But I would say, like at the end of the day, if you attempt to communicate with the professional executor and ask them questions, they should be answering your questions. Um, there may be a misunderstanding about processes or even your entitlement and things like that that can be easily cleared up with open lines of communication. However, if there's truly a situation where a professional executor is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, or worse, they're actually doing, they're doing something potentially, fraudulent, or
They're doing harm.
they're doing harm, exactly. Then there is recourse. Every province, there's legislation on these matters. It's taken very seriously. So there's recourse for beneficiaries to essentially go to court to sort it out, and the court will basically demand to see what the executor's activities have been, and the executor needs to account for all of their activities, and then the court will make a ruling. But I think the caution there is that If it's a misunderstanding, it's really best addressed outside of the court.
As always.
As always, the court will often, cause a lot more delays, a lot more, unfortunately, expenses, potentially for everyone involved, including the estate. And you might really not actually end up with a satisfactory answer, right? And for the most part, as long as the executor is acting reasonably and prudently and following what they're expected to do, and what they're expected to do, quite simply, is to preserve, protect, and then distribute the estate assets after settling the debts, right? So sometimes beneficiaries may have expectations that the executor do something that actually does not fall within that description, and then that causes, a lot of friction and issues that clear and open communication would probably be the best approach to deal with.
I mean, last question, the best. How's ClearEstate different? How's ClearEstate better from a professional executor standpoint? What's the uniqueness of the offer that ClearEstate, I mean, for the planner, but also for beneficiaries?
We've talked before, I think, about, how our process is, a step-by-step process that on the planning side of things, the goal is to break everything down into manageable steps and then, help you to carry out those steps, right? And make informed decisions along the way. I think the settlement process is actually quite similar in that it's also broken down into sort of manageable steps, right? And when ClearEstate is acting, in that capacity, there's visibility for the beneficiary as well, because they can access our platform through the beneficiary portal, providing they're identified properly and all of those things. And when they do that, they can actually see a certain view of what's transpiring in the estate settlement. We're proactively engaging them and sort of reporting to them. And they do have the ability to, ask their questions, right? And I would say, to a certain extent, there's process, right? And sometimes process includes, templates and messaging that we know will help get ahead of any potential issues. But on top of that, we have a team of experienced professionals who are actually looking at the specific circumstances in that estate, and the specific questions. And sometimes actually it's like they're asking one question, but it's not the real question that they mean, because you can just tell, like through experience, you could just tell, okay, I see what they're kind of getting at here, and it actually has to do with something else. And you're able to then explain that other thing that actually is the relevant thing for them, So I think that's the key piece, is us being able to kind of combine the efficient, effective use of technology to make the processes simpler, but then also to have experts involved to actually, make sure that everything is done correctly, and also, help with those communications to the families.
At a lower cost.
At a lower cost, of course.
Sarah, thank you so much. I think Christine was such a champion. You're such a champion. I think, after spending these number of years in the field of estate planning and estate settlement, I've become an absolute convert to the concept of professional executorship. I think most people should not put their families through this. I mean, may sound a little bit self-interested here, but beyond ClearEstate, we've seen so many horror stories. It just doesn't make any sense to inflict the pain of executorship on loved ones. And I mean, we offer solutions. There's other solutions out there, but I think everybody should at least consider it very seriously and not dismiss it. And there's still a lot of education to be done. This is not something when you buy a car, you think about it for 6 months or 12 months, and then you're going to buy another car and you still think about it for 6 months or 12 months. And if you're like me, you're on Auto Trader and you're looking at other cars and you're like, okay, like what car am I gonna-" Nobody thinks about executorship this way. Nobody's thinking, what are my options in the market? Let me shop around. But I do think it's a serious decision. It has huge impact on family members. especially when there's a POA involved, especially when there's a testamentary trust involved, because these are long-term relationships and they can have a big impact. And I think naming a professional it's a huge gift to the family, and it's a gift to the beneficiaries. See you next time. Please don't forget to subscribe to the ClearEstate podcast on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform to make sure that you have access to this podcast and all new information, new content that we may put out there. Our very, very ambitious goal is to end the end-of-life burdens of Canadian and American families and bring products, services, technology, and content to you to help you deal with some of these difficult issues.
ThinkBait. TNKR Media. Good talk.